Thank you for coming to my non-defense defense. It's such a it feels very anticipatory. I feel the anticipation isn't near you. So I want to present to you the thesis that I've been working on for so long in this unique and a little bit off track type of way, which I guess for those who know me is not a surprise. But I decided to defend even though the thesis was rejected, but we can talk a little bit more. So what my plan is that I will present the work and you can come in. There's a lot to it, so I tried to limit it. I don't know if it worked, but I may skip through some slides. And of course, there's the overlying cloud of the process of how this thing got rejected and all the things that, well, basically the process which is also part of the PhD. So I'll try to put some of that in there, but maybe we'll leave that for the discussion if there's questions and we can get into that. Come in, Margaret. Thank you. Woody. Now it's complete. Now we're complete. So, let's start, shall we? Extending dissonance is the name of the thesis and my experience of the PhD. An extended period of dissonance. And first, I'll give you a little background on why dissonance. So, by the way, Lisbeth, if you can admit the people that come, you do. Okay, good. So why dissonance? So it all started back in, first of all, what is dissonance? So dissonance is what happens when new perspectives clash with old perspectives or existing realities, which is happening all the time. You get a new reality or a new perspective that sometimes comes into conflict with your existing reality. And what do we do? So this happened to me in a big way in 2013 when I was together with a man that we broke up with. The new man is here today, so it's a happy story in the end. But we broke up in 2013, and it just launched this process of dissonance in my life where I had this new reality to deal with. And in cognitive dissonance theory, so I'll put a little bit of theory in because it is a PhD presentation after all. And cognitive dissonance theory says that when you have this cognitive discrepancy or this dissonance, our motivation is to want to reduce the dissonance. So that's the immediate thing that happens when you experience a little bit of dissonance. But the question is, the question that I was asking at the time was, what happens if you can't or do not reduce the dissonance, if you can't do it? So at the time of this boyfriend breakup, I was new to Copenhagen. I couldn't really reduce the dissonance in the ways that we are used to because I couldn't really I didn't really have a fixed job, so I couldn't really replace the job. I wasn't going to just replace the boyfriend right away. Those are dissonance reduction strategies. And so it left me actually in this period of dissonance where, because I was in this new community, I had not so much to fall back on. So I was kind of forced to be lingering for a while in the unknown, which ended up being a really amazing life experience. But it took a while to realize that. So at the time, I also participated in a democracy education method called Bitsafta. This is a Israeli democracy education method from a place called the Adam Institute. And the goal is to heighten participants' awareness of the rights guaranteed in a democracy and difficulties and dilemmas that occur when these arise. So it's a little bit in line with the dissonance type experience because it has participants, it's kind of like the goal is participants to go into dilemmas. So instead of arguing what's the correct way to do democracy, they're encouraged to actually not know or to be able to take on a different perspective. So in that way, if it also uses the group dynamics, and if there's a conflict in the room, instead of conflicting, like going back and forth between different perspectives, those conflicts are converted into dilemmas. So we can feel the perspective of our own and the other. For example, the dilemma between equality and freedom that happens a lot in democracy. So what I loved about Bitsafta, this was back in 2013 when I was a participant, and I really took to the method, also because I was in this period of dissonance, so I was open to such experiences. One thing is that it shifts the reflection from result to process. So that means instead of looking at the content of content like theory, it looks rather at the process of how we arrive there. So the process of the group. The second thing is that it unsettles the traditional role of the teacher or of the theory as the authority. So you're not actually giving the class anything to kind of depend on as the knowledge. You're really letting the group kind of move through their own dynamics. And that leads to the third thing, which is that the content is generated in these group dynamics, especially in the tension between the individual and the collective, which is what democracy in practice is all about. So I love this method so much that I became a facilitator in it. I just had to, it was like I just sat in the facilitator chair and invited my friends and started practicing with my family and their friends and my friends, and just to see how this could work. Started writing grants to get projects going, and started a little organization, and then got in touch with my supervisor Maribel at here, and I said, look, I'm doing this thing, and she was really interested. So we met, and she said, oh, there's a PhD position opening. So that's how I ended up with the PhD, which now I was thinking, what's the connection between Bitsafta, this method, and CBS, which is management education? That was a little bit my missing link. But actually, management education is really the study of people and how people work together. So there's those who are here and who are at CBS know that the relevance is very clear, because this is all the practice of how people work together. So I decided to offer an elective course to undergraduate students, and it was called Between Theory and Practice, Self-Reflection for Responsible Decision-Making. And the reason for that is because I also read a lot that management education was critiqued for students not necessarily aligning what they learned in terms of responsible practices with how they are in the world. So they may have learned it in theory, but in practice, there's still this gap. So that's what I thought Bitsafta does really well, is connect that gap between theory and practice because of the use of the group. So I thought, okay, that's a good justification to do it for a business school. And that ended up being the data for this work. So I recorded the classes. The students also wrote reflection journals, and in their final exams, I asked them to reflect on their experience of the course. So that's like 10 pages of what they learned in the course. And really, I was interested in finding out the role of dissonance in this learning process. So the research questions for this work ended up being, first of all, how do they, so Bitsafta, you could say, is a way that you can purposefully extend dissonance in a classroom. So students are kind of subjected to an extended struggle or immersion, or however they take it, period of dissonance. So how did they experience this purpose? First of all, how did they experience this purposeful extension of dissonance? Second of all, what learning processes do they go through as they immerse in dissonance? So this was the second question. So what does dissonance actually mean for them? And how do they experience it in the classroom? And what do they learn from it? Can they learn something from it or not? And what are the challenges and opportunities of dissonance extension for management education? So to go a little bit through how I wrote this in the dissertation, I started off with a literature review where I looked at all the other types of programs that used something like, maybe not dissonance, but maybe uncertainty or maybe discomfort or something a little bit uncomfortable in the classroom. And I saw that there were these ingredients that the scholars pointed to, which were, first of all, the experience was very important, that it has to integrate your experience. So it's not something that you're not downloading information to the students from a PowerPoint, but it has to integrate their actual experience. Second of all, there was, in these cases, a focus on the problem. So sometimes you can call it problem-based learning or even case-based learning, where students are made to struggle with a problem and not necessarily arrive at the solution right away, but really focus a little bit more longer on the problem. The third one, where some scholars worked with, is emotions, where emotions come into the classroom. And those are often emotions because of the struggle with the problem and the experience. It involves also the group relations, and therefore emotions are going to come into it, like not necessarily easy emotions. It could be conflict, it could be anger, it could be disappointment and frustration. So these types of learning experiences also included emotions, and they use the here and now group process. So that means, like, if I were to ask you guys how we are as a group or something. And what's the goal of these of this type of learning experience? A lot of the times they claim that the goal was reflexivity, which is also a term used. So before I came to management education, I would just say self-reflection, and reflexivity is a little more pointing to the questioning of your own assumptions. So not just questioning of things outside of yourself, but your own perspective, yourself in the process. And then there was a term that I found somewhere halfway in that I thought would be applicable to look at as a kind of capability. Like, what are we actually teaching these students? What are we giving them as a skill? And I found this term called negative capability, which is the ability to be in uncertainty. So I thought I could, this was used a lot in management education like in leadership learning, how to learn creativity. So I thought I would explore a little bit this term because it wasn't so used or so detailed in the literature that I saw. And I questioned whether this could be a reflexive capacity. So methodology, I used grounded theory and looked at ways that, so how do I identify dissonance in the study? Through these dissonance reduction strategies. It was this abductive approach. So I used, I identified dissonance through dissonance reduction strategies, through difficult emotions that I was able to pinpoint, and group dynamics. And how did I identify learning? I used Mesereau, which he has a transformative learning theory, which starts from a place of disorientation or a dilemma. So it was a very useful theory to use. And I looked at his distinctions between content, process, and premise reflections. I won't go too deep into that because time, but if you're interested, you can ask later. And then, of course, my own reflexivity is really important because I'm both the facilitator of the group, the researcher in the process, and have all this double role. So I took that into account, and I'll talk about that later too. And as well as ethics, which is, because I'm the facilitator / researcher, it's also very important to prepare the students and to take care of their emotional safety. And because they don't actually know that they're coming into this classroom, they don't know that this is coming. They just think they signed up for a fun elective where they can get a good grade. So they have no idea what's coming. So there's an ethical component too. So findings. So I centered the findings around the 3 research questions, of course, which are which look at how is dissonance experienced, what are the learning processes involved, and challenges and opportunities. So I found also in this process that as I was looking at myself being the facilitator, I wasn't just facilitating dissonance in the classroom, but I was doing a lot of management. I was actually doing maybe more management than facilitation at some point. So that also was a little bit surprising for me to see kind of in myself in the study. And I found that there's these different ways that I tried to facilitate dissonance and different ways that I tried to manage dissonance, and then different ways that the students tried to reduce their dissonance. Is everybody with me? Okay. So one way that, for example, I'll give you an example, and now it's going to go through a few examples. So I'll try to kind of use the first one as our main example to delve into and give a little bit, just a more superficial info on the rest of them. So one dissonance reduction strategy is pursuing agreement. That means that the class, when there was a moment of dissonance or discomfort, they would try to come to an agreement in the group. And as a facilitator, I would try to break that group harmony a little bit by pointing out that, wait, there was a disagreement here. So I would, if somebody disagreed and somebody tried to kind of smooth it over, I would try to say, wait, but there was a disagreement here, and just bring that to the surface. At the same time, you can't do too much of that and create a very disharmonious group. So there's also ways that I united the group. And I'll talk a little bit later about like when is the right time to do these things. So another dissonance reduction strategy is letting the expert decide, or also looking at me as the facilitator to show me, for them to see like, wait, what's the right answer, or where is this going, or how can I get to the right, what is right here. And to facilitate that dissonance, I kind of avoided my role as the expert, or them seeing me as my role. But also on the flip side, I also summarized a lot at the end, like, what are we doing here? And just to bring that together. Dissonance reduction strategy. Some people, when they have a little bit of chaos in the group, some people jump to take the lead, and some people avoid leadership. So these are ways that just different personalities. And to facilitate that, rather than pick one personality, it's to emphasize that there's different ways to participate. And to manage it is to equally question both these types of personalities. Okay, and then avoidance, and then I won't go through everyone, but for example, the last one, defending oneself, there's often this perspective, like, even when there's feelings involved and people are hurt, somebody will say, well, it's just a game. Come on, it's just a game. So then I would say, okay, who thinks it's a game? Who thinks it's more serious? And we kind of get the dissonance out a little bit. And then also to manage it, take it to the meta level. Like, why are we doing this? What is this about? Okay, and then some of the ways that I facilitate dissonance is also by really pointing to the group process whenever I can. So for example, if we're talking about topics in democracy like prostitution or abortion or some hot topics, you can say, and students are getting into it, and then I would say something like, okay, please look around and kind of try to regulate yourselves in the debate. So don't count on me to pick on you. So they have to kind of think, wait, they have to kind of take a different level of their experience. So now they're not just expressing their perspective, but they also have to pay attention to what's going on in the room. And the reason for that, that's another way to kind of align theory and practice, because you're not just talking about democratic processes and expressing your opinion about it, but suddenly you realize that you are in a democratic process. And through these dissonance reduction strategies, I also came up with criteria for what could be criteria for negative capability, this ability to be in uncertainty. And that, for example, is, for this first one of pursuing agreement, the criteria for negative capability could be accepting disagreement. Now, I should say that this is not like all the criteria of negative capability are going to be in this column. Because it could be that someone's dissonance reduction strategy is pursuing disagreement. It could be the exact opposite. I'll get to that also a little bit later. So then there's these learning journeys that I mapped out in the thesis. I have 5 learning journeys that correspond to each one's way to transform their dissonance reduction strategy into a kind of a criteria for negative capability through their writing. And I'll go through Francesca's journey and maybe a little bit of Linda. Yeah. So, oh, yes, but first, to just get a sense of like, what are the activities, and this is not, I don't have like an activity for you guys to do. It says activity for you. It's just to get a sense of what students would be going through in the classroom. So you can just sit through it, or you can actually do it as you wish. We're just going to take a minute for me to tell you what happens, and you can imagine yourselves in it if you don't have a piece of paper and a pen. But basically, for example, if you were to work with a partner next to you, just work with the person sitting next to you, and the instruction would be, without speaking, draw equality. So just take a minute without speaking to draw what is equality. People online can just chill or do whatever. Without speaking, draw equality. And I can take a water break. Finish. A plus. Okay, so the next part of what I would do here is give each student 3 cards, red, yellow, and green. And I would ask them to say what they thought about this result, like how they feel about this result. Okay. And I would ask them, for example, are you satisfied with the result? And they would say red, yellow, green. We can do it. Sometimes I do it like with thumbs up if you don't have. So are you satisfied with this result? Yes, no, maybe. You can put your thumb up. All you. Thumbs up. Okay, of course, because we just started the group, except Lucy's experience. Okay, and then I would ask, and then we would talk a little bit about the result, why, what, and then I would ask, are you satisfied with the process? That's that 1 minute that it took to get to the result. And would you say red, green, red, yellow? What would you say? Process? Maybe you would say like, oh, too short. Maybe some, what would you, who would put their thumb down? What would you say? Or yeah, what would you say a little bit? Process.
Well, that we haven't worked much together, and maybe I was starting off too fast, just taking the pen deciding that I have to go first.
Okay, good. And that would, and so we'd get a few of these answers, and that would lead to the next question, which is, was the process equal? And then people have to think for a second, like, was the process equal? What do you mean equal? Even though we just spent our like an instinct doing like, what is equality? Boom, boom, boom. But when I ask, was the process equal? You're like, wait, what is equality? So you have to take again the question, but through the experience that you just had, which is different than taking the question theoretically. Now I would say, so what happened in with Francesca's group, this sometimes happens in a group. I don't think anybody here broke the no speaking rule. Did anybody break the rule? No. Yes, you broke the rule. So then I would ask you guys, do you think it was still equal? No. Trick question, okay. So sometimes people say, especially this is an activity to do in the first class, and people say, yes, 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 it was equal, we're good, pursuing agreement, right? We're good, all is good, group harmony. Then I would say, but you guys broke the rule, right? So was it still equal relative to the whole group? And then they would say, a lot of the times they would say, yes, it was still equal, because anybody would have broken the rule. Anybody could break the rule. And so then I tried to like poke a little bit, but not too much because I'm still first day and have to be on my best behavior. But in this group, there was a point where I said, could anybody really break the rule? And then another participant, Leslie, said, no, actually, I wouldn't have broken the rule because I grew up in a very strict household, so it's not equal. So at that point, Francesca, now I didn't know this at the time, but she wrote her whole 10-page paper about this moment where she was like so annoyed with Leslie, who was breaking the harmony. And she says, I'm going to have to read a little bit of text. She says, on one hand, I struggled during the class to question my own thoughts and to try to make sense of hers. Instead, I grew irritated and stubborn. I do not recall whether or not this was showing in class, as I do not recall the process in detail. I do, however, remember thinking of clever arguments inside my head and being eager to have her agree with me and thereby to win. So Francesca keeps going through the class, and so the class keeps being faced with these types of experiences where I kind of say, oh, but is it like that? Is the process, is the group democratic? Can everybody have the right to speak? Are the people who have English as the first language not more privileged, stuff like that? I question them a little bit, and they get slowly more, a little bit less likely to just react, but they kind of take a little time to think about it. So she says in her final paper, this is Francesca, she says, my idea was that you could almost always look at a situation and decide whether or not it was equal. notice how I am writing was a lot. I have not changed my mind about this, but my idea has been challenged. And I realized that what is often a simple black and white question for me may be debatable for some. So this is quite a step to go from, no, we are all equal to, wait, maybe it's debatable. And then she says, as the class continued, more conversations like this one happened, although I felt a difference regarding the matter I've just addressed. I feel as if the classes became increasingly open, which I would say, did the classes become open or did you become more open? And that the conversations became easier for me to attempt to address as dialogues, even when I disagreed with others. I feel it became easier to listen and challenge my own opinions by being aware. Perhaps this was a result of the bonding that happened in the class along the way, but it could also be a result of increased self-reflection. Okay, and the next one is a bit long, but this is a paragraph that she says in class. So the one I just read was on her paper, but in class she says, she confronts Leslie and she says, I said everybody had the opportunity to cheat and you said something about no, and that helped my reflection because I thought, of course you can cheat. But then I thought if she really cannot live with her, so she starts to kind of understand this perspective of like, wait, maybe she really can't cheat. Then we do have different braces. Now, what's interesting about this quote is that then she takes it to a different arena here, where she says, that makes me think about the exam. We were talking about like, how are you going to grade us? And we're thinking pass fail. And I was thinking that's a bit unfair because maybe the ones that don't say as much. So she starts to apply this, what she just got from this conversation, to the way that we grade. She says, this is one of the things I feel is kind of undemocratic about this. We all come from different places and yet we have different resources, but we are examined in the same way. So she makes my job a little bit more difficult, which I love. And then I was looking at negative capability as rather the ability to transform dissonance into reflexivity. So again, acceptance of disagreement. Francesca says, I can now allow disagreement instead of needing to win others over. For taking responsibility, there was a girl, Elizabeth, and through this process, there was an activity where she was noticing herself like watching the group, and she was judging the group and thinking, why is it taking them so long to make a decision? And then she started to think, wait, if I'm judging the group, then am I not part of the group? And so she kind of did this, like, she really changed her reflection from looking at the group as the problem to thinking, wait, am I not part of the group? And am I not making it more difficult actually by not participating? Then there's ways that the group also comes to a perspective transformation. When I, for example, somewhere halfway through the class, I started the class and said, okay, should we do an activity? And somebody said, what happens if we say no? And this would not have happened on the first day, which is also a great thing for me to hear. And I said, okay, if we say no, let's talk about it. What should we do? And then another group that started to question whether, I asked, is this group democratic? No, because you are the facilitator and we didn't pick you. Oh, but we can fire her. And a whole conversation about how they could fire me. Yeah. And then I think I'll just briefly say the last one and then we'll move on because we can take this up a little bit more in the discussion. So Linda had this defensive and competitive stance always, and then she realized, well, where did all this competitiveness come from? And then she also reflected on it in her paper. I did grow up in a very competitive house and my culture, and she kind of took back that reflection and said, why do I always have to, what is this competition? Why do I always have to win? I'm going to skip that one. So basically, I have pages and pages in my office on different diagrams on how I can put this thing into one diagram that would be the diagram. And I couldn't do it. And I had big papers and small papers and 3D papers, and I just couldn't do it. So I decided to do it like this, which maybe is why I'm here. Basically, the simple version is that dissonance could take let's say it could take two paths. It could be suppressed as dissonance reduction strategies, and it could be transformed into a reflective process. Now, what's important, which I emphasized in the discussion assessment committee, is that it's missing the temporal and actually also spatial component, which is the practice of going that first level of suppressing the dissonance into dissonance reduction strategies is also part of the second level. So you go through that first part as many times as you need, and you take it into the reflection on the second part. That's how it doesn't just transform into reflexivity. It's a practice. Lottie has a solution already. We'll get to that in the discussion. Okay, so challenges. So how do we know dissonance is transformed? So on the first version, so I've done this. This is a thesis that's been is proudly rejected 3 times. So first rejection, the assessment committee pointed out that how do we know that the students are not faking their reflexivity, considering you're grading them, and don't they just want to tell you what you want to hear to get a good grade? And initially I dismissed the question, which was my fault and responsibility. And I actually even questioned the assessment committee's question. Not a wise thing to do. And I just couldn't get into that question, because I thought, why would they be faking their reflexivity? These are people that I've gotten to know and that are sharing these intimate details about themselves and admitting that of their competitive nature. And I just didn't think that was relevant at all. And second, then afterwards, when I thought about it a little more, I thought, okay, maybe there are those who can fake their reflexivity for the teachers. And I started to point out places where that maybe could be done. And considering that's the data that I use for the whole study, I acknowledge that this is an important component to address. Now, the second challenge is, so like I said, the dissonance reduction strategies that I use, like pursuing agreement, is not necessarily to be to have a value placed on it, like that's bad or that's good. It depends on the group dynamics, and pursuing agreement could just equally be a dissonance reduction strategy as pursuing disagreement. No need to defend is a dissonance reduction strategy in this study, but maybe there is a need to defend, which could be just as valid. So the assessment committee rather wanted me to, instead of this type of critique or reflection, is to talk about why reflexivity is a good thing, and to show more the limits of reflexivity as being good. We can get back to that in the discussion too, because I think it's really interesting in terms of perspective mismatches. Of course, power and safe space have a huge role in this, because after all, I'm the one who's delivering this experience, and I have to take power and relinquish power and address the ways in which I'm actually going in to facilitate this whole experience for students that are not necessarily signed up for this, let's say. And also safe space, that ties into how to create a safe space for these students who don't know what they're coming into. And the question of how to know when to extend or to manage dissonance, or to learn to facilitate. In the thesis, I treat it as a kind of, there's an article, Facilitate First Thyself, which is once you see through your own dissonance reduction strategies, it makes it much easier to facilitate. But we can also get back to that. Okay, and the opportunities, as the third research question asks for, is it moves students from a place of reaction to responding, from reacting to something to responding, because they realize that their reaction may be a dissonance reduction strategy. And they can, once you reflect on that, that doesn't have as much of a habitual process for you. You can be coming more from a place of responding, which is what we're trying to teach management students, responsibility. As well, from the individual to the collective. That doesn't mean, I always tell the students that if we're doing a thing on inclusion, that you walk into a bar and you have to include everybody in your talk, but rather that you are aware of your role in as an independent mover to an interdependent one, and that has to do with how we use our resources in the world. And this one maybe is not so popular to speak like this in academia, but from mind knowledge to heart knowledge, which is a lot of the knowledge that was shared in this class had to do with sharing from the heart, or intuitive understanding of people, which was very hard to translate or to talk about and sometimes in this framework. Okay, limitations and further research. I mapped out a couple of ways that dissonance can go, can it also take other paths? That's a one. Students could also be involved in the analysis as like a kind of a true intersubjective research would be. They would be not only the people going through the experience, but also help to then analyze their own experiences. The role of identity is a big one that I don't delve too much into, but of course I talk a little bit about some of how they talk about themselves. And I talk more about dissonance facilitation, but there's also a lot to say about dissonance management and how to create that safe space, because maybe the facilitation wouldn't be possible without the safe space. And then, of course, I have my own process. So a lot of the conversations with my supervisors were like, well, what are the students getting out of this? What are you trying to get them to do? And I was like, well, it's the process. It's not really the outcome. It's all about the process. And so it's the process kind of becomes the outcome. And that's what it was in my experience too. And then in my experience, all the processes count, from the power dynamics of the department to the supervision dynamics, to the feedback dynamics, to the global events. All of these had a role in the thesis itself. Sometimes the advice was to put those to the side so you can focus on the thesis. But in this case, I felt that they were actually very relevant. And then, of course, the 3 rejections are 3 opportunities for my own negative capability development, which is the way that the process, my own process was like living this PhD and allowing what I found about the students to also work in myself. And that's the last slide. Thank you for your listening.